I graduated believing I'd finally earned my place in our family empire. But the folder on my father's desk revealed I was being restructured out of existence. When I asked why, my mother coldly stated I was the muscle of the company, not the mind, dismissing a decade of my unpaid 80-hour weeks. They thought they were phasing out a worker, but they didn't realize they were unplugging the only thing keeping their legacy alive. That was the day I stopped giving them my life. And the fallout started with a single, desperate phone call from my father about our biggest client. Before I tell you how it unfolded, tap like and comment where you're listening from, especially if you've ever been erased by family. My name is Julian Thorne. For as long as I can remember, my value in this family was measured by the thickness of the callus on my palms and the grease that permanently stained the cuticles of my fingernails. Our manufacturing plant, Thorne Industries, sat on the industrial edge of a city that never seemed to stop growing. It was a sprawling maze of corrugated steel, echoing with the rhythmic thud of hydraulic presses and the high-pitched whine of CNC machines. The air inside always tasted of ozone, scorched metal, and the heavy scent of old oil that had seeped into the very foundation of the building. To the outsiders, the politicians, and the local press, Thorne Industries was a shining beacon of family, unity a testament to what grit and blood could build together. But inside those steel walls, the reality was a quiet, suffocating hierarchy that no one ever dared to speak out loud. My father, Silas Thorne, was a man who lived for the theater of authority. He didn't just walk the factory floor, he patrolled it like a king inspecting a battlefield. He loved to run his fingers over a finished turbine housing or a custom-milled engine block, nodding solemnly while talking about legacy. He'd say that word with a weight that made it feel like a holy command. Every drop of sweat is an investment in the Thorne name. Julian, he'd tell me, his eyes never quite meeting mine, always looking past me at the machines. My mother, Evelyn, was the architect of our public deception. She handled the optics, as she called it. She was a woman of silk scarves and expensive perfumes, moving through charity galas and high-end boardrooms with a grace that masked a heart made of cold, unyielding flint. Between the two of them, the future was never a question of merit. It was a prize they had already polished and set aside for my younger brother, Leo. Leo was the golden boy, the one they kept far away from the dirt. He never had to scrub a cooling tank or calibrate a faulty sensor in the middle of a July heatwave. While I was in the pits, my face covered in soot, learning the intricate language of the machines. Leo was being groomed for the visionary roles. He was the one featured in under-30 business magazines, leaning against mahogany desks in suits that cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. My parents looked at him like he was the sun, something to be admired from a distance, something that gave their lives light. When they looked at me, they just saw a tool. I was the hammer, the wrench, the engine. I was reliable, I was durable, and because I was family, I was supposedly free. I learned very early that survival in the Thorne house meant being useful. While other kids spent their summers at lakeside camps or traveling through Europe, I was in the warehouse. I spent my teenage years learning how to fix the mistakes that the senior engineers couldn't even diagnose. I learned the weight of raw steel and the exact sound a gear makes right before it's about to shatter. My knuckles were permanently scarred from slipped wrenches and hot sparks. My parents called it building character and learning the business. From the ground up, I realize now they were just building a slave who wouldn't complain because he thought he was working for his own future. By the time I finished my master's degree in industrial engineering, I truly believed the dynamic would finally shift. I didn't come back with just a degree. I came back with a blueprint for the next 20 years. I had developed systems for automation, global logistics, and thermal efficiency that could have scaled. Thorne Industries from a local powerhouse to a global competitor. I imagined sitting in those high-level strategy meetings, finally being asked for my opinion, instead of just being told which sector had a leak. I imagined the silence at the dinner table finally being broken by a conversation about innovation, not just my father's demands for higher quotas. But the day I walked back into the office, my father didn't even look up from his ledger. He handed me a radio and told me the cooling system in Sector 4 was vibrating again. Go handle it, Julian. You're the only one who knows the quirks of that old unit. I worked harder than ever. 60-hour weeks were a slow week for me. 80 to 90 hours became the norm. I was the first one in, often arriving when the city was still shrouded in blue morning mist, and the last one to leave, locking the gates under the cold glow of the security lights. Payment was always a future conversation. Every time I brought up a salary or a formal contract, my father would sigh, a practiced sound of disappointment, and tell me that as a partner in waiting, I didn't need a paycheck, I was building equity. It's all going to be yours one day, he'd say, waving a hand vaguely at the factory floor. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe that the pain in my back and the constant ache in my hands meant something. But the erasure was constant. When we landed a massive contract with a state developer, Leo was the one who stood in front of the cameras, holding the ceremony. When a machine broke at 3 a.m. on a Sunday, I was the only one whose phone rang. My mother once watched me loading a heavy shipment into a truck, my shirt soaked with sweat, and she smiled that terrifyingly hollow smile. She told me I was lucky to have the physical stamina for the dirt because Leo simply didn't have the constitution for such things. She meant it as reassurance. I heard it as a life sentence. The real shift, the one I couldn't ignore, started quietly. It was the small things, the way conversations would abruptly stop when I walked into the break room, or the way the high-level strategy meetings started happening at my parents' house on Sunday evenings, gatherings I was never invited to. I'd show up on Monday morning and find out that we had changed. Raw material suppliers or altered our shipping lanes without a single word to me. The person who actually managed those operations, Leo, had hired a consultancy firm that seemed to do nothing but produce glossy brochures and funnel company money into private accounts. I was the one absorbing the damage. When the cheap, low-grade steel Leo ordered started failing in the field, it wasn't Leo who took the calls from furious clients. It was me. I was the one who drove 4 states over, slept in my truck and performed on site. Repairs just to keep the Thornton name from being dragged through the mud. My father would just rub his forehead and tell me cash flow was tight. Whenever I asked about the bonuses I'd been promised for saving those accounts. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Friday night in November. The workshop was unusually quiet, the night shift having been sent home early due to a power fluctuation. My father had asked me to find some maintenance logs for an insurance audit. I went into his office, the smell of expensive cigars and old paper clinging to the air. I knew where the master files were. As I pulled open the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, a thick, cream-colored envelope caught my eye. It didn't have a company logo. It had the seal of the city's most prestigious estate law firm. My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs as I opened it. It wasn't an audit. It was a succession and ownership transfer agreement. I sat on the floor of the dark office, the only light coming from the street lamp outside the window, and I read every single word. 100% of the voting shares, the physical assets, and the intellectual property of Thorn Industries were being signed over to Leo on his 25th birthday. I turned the pages, my hand shaking, looking for my name. I found it in a small, coldly worded paragraph at the very bottom. Julian Thorn shall be retained as head of maintenance, and operations for a mandatory transition period of 24 months to ensure technical stability. Following this period, his role will be reassessed based on the new CEO's vision for restructuring. They weren't just giving Leo the company, they were giving Leo me. I was being treated like a piece of depreciating machinery, something to be used until the new owner understood how to turn it on, and then discarded once it became an eyesore. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a chair. I sat there in the silence for 3 hours, watching the rain streak against the glass, realizing that every sacrifice I had made for 10 years had been a gift to a brother who didn't respect me and parents who didn't love me. That was the night the Julian Thorn they knew died. The next Monday, the change was immediate, though they were too arrogant to notice. I didn't arrive at 5 a.m. I showed up at 9 a.m., wearing a crisp suit I hadn't touched in years, my hands clean. My father was standing by the main assembly line, looking frantic. "Julian, where have you been?" The secondary press is jammed, and the tech team says they can't bypass the safety lock. I looked at him, my expression a blank mask. "I've put in a ticket with the external maintenance contractor. Dad, they should be here by Wednesday. In the meantime, I'll be in my office, reviewing the logistics, reports." He looked at me like I had spoken in a foreign language. "Wednesday? We lose $50,000 a day if that line is down. Fix it now." I didn't move. I'm focusing on the vision and restructuring side of things now, just like the transition plan suggests. Technical issues are for the operational staff. I stopped answering the midnight calls. I stopped cushioning the impact of Leo's disastrous decisions. When Leo forgot to renew the EPA permits for our chemical waste, I didn't stay up all night filing the emergency paperwork. I let the fine hit the desk. When a shipment of faulty valves arrived, I didn't stay late to manually inspect them. I let them go to the floor. The system was a delicate clock that ran only because I was constantly oiling the gears in secret. Without me, the friction started to heat up. Within 2 weeks, our quality control ratings, which I had kept at 99%, plummeted to 70%. The real explosion happened during the Grand Legacy dinner my parents had invited. Silas Vance, a billionaire developer whose multi-year Contract was the only thing keeping the company's massive debt from crushing us. The dinner was at a 5-star restaurant, the table set with crystal and silver. Leo was at the head, rambling about leveraging synergistic paradigms and other nonsense he'd read in a blog. My father was beaming, already picturing himself retired on a beach while I kept the factory running in the background. I waited until the main course was served. Then I pulled a copy of the transfer papers out of my jacket and laid them on the table, right between the wine decanter and Leo's plate. The silence that followed was absolute. My father's face went from a proud red to a sickly, pale grey. "Julian, what is this?" I made sure Silas Vance heard every word. "It's my formal resignation, and a notice of intent to sue for 10 years of unpaid wages and intellectual property theft. Since I'm just the muscle and I'm being phased out anyway, I figured I'd get a head start on my own future." My mother tried to laugh it off, calling me dramatic and emotional. I looked at Silas Vance and told him, "Silas, you might want to check the security protocols on the project. I'm building for you. I'm the only one with the encryption keys for the automated controllers. And since I'm no longer an employee, those keys will revoke themselves at midnight tonight for security reasons." My father's phone rang. It was the plant manager, screaming that the entire facility had gone into lockdown mode. The gears had stopped. The lights were out. Silas Vance stood up, his eyes cold as he looked at my father. "You told me Leo was the architect of this system. Silas, you told me Julian was just the foreman." He turned to me, a small, knowing smile on his face. "It seems I've been talking to the wrong Thorn." And I walked out of that restaurant as the shouting started. I didn't look back. Within 48 hours, Silas Vance pulled the contract, citing a breach of technical trust. Without that cash flow, the Thorn legacy was nothing but a mountain of debt and empty promises. The fallout was a slow-motion car crash. My parents had leveraged the family estate to fund Leo's vision, and with the Vance contract gone, the banks didn't wait. A month later, a foreclosure sign sat in the front yard of the house I had spent my weekends repairing for free. My father called me 18 times that morning. When I finally answered, his voice was broken. "Julian, the bank is taking everything. We need you to come home. We can talk about the ownership. We can fix this." I stood in my new warehouse, a clean, modern space I had leased with a small loan from Silas Vance himself. "I'm home, Dad," I said, "and the only thing that needs fixing is the idea that my labor belongs to you." Vanguard Operations, my new firm, started with 5 people. They were the 5 best technicians from the Thorn plant, people who had been sidelined and underpaid just like me. They didn't follow the name Thorn. They followed the man who actually knew how the machines breathed. We weren't a family business in the toxic sense. We were a team. Every person had equity. Every person was seen. Meanwhile, my mother tried one last desperate play. She showed up at my office, her expensive coat looking frayed at the edges. She didn't apologize. She asked for a loan to save her reputation so she could attend a gala. I looked at her, the woman who had called me the muscle, with a smile. I wrote her a check for $400,000, and once you take it, you never call me again. She took the check. The greed was stronger than her pride. The final victory wasn't the money or the new factory. It was the day I drove past the old Thorn plant. It was being sold at auction. I bought the land in the building through a holding company. I didn't reopen it as Thorn Industries. I tore down the old signs and painted Vanguard across the steel. I stood on that same road, the smell of rain-washed asphalt in the air, but the weight on my shoulders was gone. I realized then that my value was never something my parents could grant or take away. It was built in the scars on my hands and the knowledge in my brain. I was no longer a tool in someone else's shed. I was the master of my own forge.